All right, I think we're all here. I think here's Mary. So welcome everybody to the presentation today. We are focusing on the anatomy of a good paper and writing a solid practice-oriented piece. And we have a great panel. But before I introduce them, let me remind you that throughout the presentation, you should put questions in the Q&A box if you have any questions, and those questions can be upvoted, and then at the end of sort of the panel discussion, we'll turn to your questions and try to answer as many as we can. So we have assembled a great panel. I'm, of course, Gabriele Piccoli. I am the editor-in-chief of MISQ Executive. And I have with me three great senior editors. Mary Lassity, who's the Walton Professor of Information Systems and the Director of the Blockchain Center for Excellence in the Sam Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas, and a Fellow of the Association for Information Systems. I have Dr. Martin Moker from the ESB Business School at Reutlingen University in Germany. He's also a research affiliate at the Sloan School of Management at the MIT, and he's an accomplished book author and a case writer and a long-standing SC at MISQ-E. And of course, Dr. Richard Watson. He's the Regent Professor and the Rex Fuqua Distinguished Chair of Internet Strategy in the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. He's a recipient of the Leo Award and recently rejoined as an SC at MISQ Executive with a specific charge to try to increase the number of submissions that focus on sustainability and the role of information systems in ecological sustainability. So thank you to the panelists for being here to share their wisdom. And the way we organize this is as follows. I will let each one of the panelists sort of take a few minutes to tell you their perspective, given their long experience on writing practice-oriented research. And then we will enter kind of a panel discussion that I will moderate. I have a couple of ideas that I want reactions from the panel on. And then we'll open it up for questions. So remember, as people are speaking and your questions come to you, drop them in the Q&A box. And from there, they can be upvoted, and then we'll select them at the end and ask them for you. So let's start with Mary.
Okay. All right. Well, Gabe, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity here. And I want to give a shout out to the AIS staff. They've been tremendously helpful. And welcome to all of the people who chose to attend here today. So I'm going to give you an overview of an entire research process if you're interested in studying emerging technologies or emerging practices that will help practitioners. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm so excited and proud of this. We just published this in the Journal of Information Technology. So I just want to make you aware of it and give you an overview of it. And if you're here today because you want your research to matter to practice, we have developed an entire end-to-end research methodology from selecting a good research topic, engaging with practitioners, through to how you write it up for academic and practitioner audiences. I can testify that this method works because my dear friend and colleague, Professor Leslie Wilcox, and I have been using this method for 30 years, and we finally decided to formalize it. And you might say, well, why now? Why'd you wait so long? Well, Leslie has just retired from the London School of Economics, and apparently now I'm a senior scholar. So at this stage in your career, you start to think about building your Egyptian pyramids. You know, what legacy do you want to leave behind? And Leslie and I and Danny Gosman really hope that we can help inspire our PhD students and assistant professors to engage in research that engages practitioners and helps influence them. Okay, now, one of the things that I think that is really exciting about our research is that it is truly valued by practitioners. And we really don't have a good method for studying emerging IS practices or technologies because they're so new. You can't use quantitative research. There's no population to sample yet. So what we do is we engage with the practitioners who have implemented a new IS practice or a new IS technology very early on. And we engage with them after their implementations are complete so that they have a view as to the outcomes they got. And other practitioners, the other 85% of potential adopters or soon to be adopters, really value when academics do this because they really question, what's new about an emerging IS practice or technology, or what's the same about it? Which do I need new practices? Can I use my old practices, etc. And they love when academics do this because we're different than journalists, right? Journalists go for the scoop and then move on to the next topic. The consultants are trying to sell them services. The IT providers are trying to sell them software or hardware. And so they really value when academics provide objective, rigorous, and relevant evidence as to what's new or different and about an emerging IS practice or technology. So we call our approach the action principles approach, and that's the output of the research process. And an action principle really attributes an action that a manager can take to produce an outcome. So there's a sense of causality here. And it's based on a real life implementation. So I thought I'd just give you an example. Our paper really takes you through the entire research process, and we applied it to our service automation research. So we talked about how we did robotic process automation and cognitive automation to develop these action principles. And what's kind of magical about them is you start building insights for practice even with your first engagement. So I just have here on the screen an example of an action principle that was generated from the first 4 engagements of looking at robotic process automation at 4 companies: Ascension Shared Services, the Associated Press, Telefonica O2, and Exchanging. And very early on, it became apparent to us that despite what was happening in the press saying automation was going to get rid of all these human jobs and all the humans were going to be out of work, our practitioners were using these technologies to really liberate their human workforce. So they were automating the boring, redundant tasks of a person's job and liberating them to focus on more value-added work. And so that's kind of where we started with the beginning to build action principles with our early engagements. And then the paper takes you all the way through after we had done 22 studies of organizational adoptions. Now, the output of the action principles approach is a set of action principles, and we ended up with 39 action principles on how you get business value from deploying robotic process and cognitive automation. It's kind of a lot, right? 39 principles. So we organize them along adoption phase, like strategy formulation, which processes do you choose to automate, which automation tools do you get. Now, here's kind of the magic that Gabe loves about this approach. We then take those action principles and say, what are the ones that we see across all kinds of practices and all kinds of technologies? And those are things like top management support. And we often get those as a finding in an MIS quarterly executive submission. But really what we're interested in, what practitioners are interested in, is what's unique. What's unique about managing these technologies? So just one example of a unique finding we had for strategy. Of course, we had the need for top management support, but we also found that in our adoption studies that you should use RPA first, robotic process automation first, because it's cheaper and easier to deploy. And that serves as kind of forward reconnaissance for the more complicated AI or cognitive automations. And that helps build up internal capabilities over time. And the paper has a lot more explanation about the other unique action principles. The other thing I love about our action principles approach is that it's grounded in data. So these are actually live deployments, but the practices can emerge and the action principles can emerge over time because practices and technologies do mature. So for example, in our early case studies, the practitioners were all doing it themselves. There was no service automation consulting firms out there to help them with their implementations. But by year 2 of this study, all of a sudden, Deloitte's got a big practice, ISG has a big practice, and now we start to see that the next set of adopters are relying on these consulting firms to help them with their automation journeys. So that's some of the things I just love about it. Now, a lot of assistant professors or PhD students say, is it worth the risk trying to focus on relevant research aimed at practice? And I won't say all of our successes from just this research project, but my answer is yes, people, it's worth the risk. It's great fun. Practitioners really do value academic research. And with that, Gabe, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mary. This is great. And I'd encourage everybody to go and read the paper. I think the value here is oftentimes we spend a lot of time in PhD programs teaching the sort of the academic methodology, and we don't have really blueprints, I find, for how to do the practice-oriented work. So this is definitely helpful. And Rick also has been doing it for a long time, so I'm sure he has ideas about how to do it. Rick, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Gabe. Well, good morning, everybody. It was nice to see some friends and family in the audience. I, in fact, saw my academic granddaughter, Sam, in the audience. I'm going to talk about my approach to looking at the issue of developing practical articles. And I'm going to take the recipe model that Mary introduced, and mine is even more basic. It goes back to Mrs. Beaton's book of household management, which was the first recipe book. She actually wrote this when she was 21 and she died at 25, giving birth to her first child. And she's famous for saying, first catch your beef. So my question is, what's your beef? What is it that you want to say in this article that is interesting to somebody, that will tell practitioners something new that they would benefit from hearing about? So I'm going to use some examples from the various articles I've written with my co-authors for MISQ Executive. Here's one that we did about CareStream, and the abstract gives you the beef. You can see this was a company that was a spin-off of Kodak. Most people were familiar with Kodak at that time. And they had to become a separate organization, and their software that they inherited was written for a company like Kodak, whereas this was a totally different company. And so the case describes the process that the CIO had to go through in building a new organization with a collection of software that was designed to support a different sort of organization. This was a great opportunity for us because we worked with the CIO of the company in writing this case. So we learned a lot about divestiture. The second question is, once you think you've got your beef, is what's the best cut? And there are basically three approaches that you can take to examining causal effects. You can do association, which is typically a survey. And in most cases, this is done late in the process. If you remember Mary's diagram, this is done at the top or after the peak. Enough data is out there, enough people are practicing something that you can do a survey. This is too late, as Mary pointed out. If people are well into implementation and using a particular methodology or new technology, it's too late to really tell them something. The response you'll get is, we already knew that. Like Mary, I agree in looking at interventions. What are the early stage things that people are doing? Because companies want to learn what works. How do we make it work? What are the benefits of this intervention? So case studies are an excellent way to study interventions amongst the early adopters. And then finally, you can do counterfactuals, which is essentially building a simulation model or a digital twin where you can examine different situations. These tend to be very context dependent. So if you're trying to influence practitioners, your real choice is just to look at interventions and early on in the adoption of an intervention. So now, I always find that if I can develop a diagram, I can then write the paper, because a diagram captures all of my thinking. So how do you garnish your meal? So here's one example of some garnishing that we used with a company called JBoss. This was the organization that developed the notion of professional open source. And fortunately, we were able to contact them very early on, soon after the creation of JBoss. The company had lost 500,000, had moved from Silicon Valley to Atlanta, and the founder was living in his parent-in-law's basement. That's how much money they'd lost. Over a period of about 5 years, they converted this into a viable organization and sold it for $35 million. We used Greiner's evolution and revolution model to describe various stages that JBoss went through as it grew from a startup to an organization that was sold to Red Hat. And once we developed this diagram, we could explain all of the phases and garnish the story quite well. So what's the source? What's the benefit that goes with this? And typically these are the lessons that you publish in an MISQ executive submission. Here's an example from one that we did on digital transformation at Carestream, the case that I mentioned earlier. This is a second study of Carestream. These are all quotes. So this is one way to validate what you're saying, is to present quotes from the case, particularly if you can have them from senior level executives. So you'll see here we have 3 quotes from the CEO of the company who got very engaged in this case, read through it, did some copy editing of the case because it thought it told a very good story about his ability to manage a digital transformation in a company. In fact, he was thinking of moving to another company and he was going to use this as part of his portfolio to demonstrate that he was a successful CEO. So the questions from the executive really are the source in this particular case. And then finally, what's for desserts? What are you going to leave as the final taste from your paper? Something that's beyond the case, that is more general and has very broad and generic lessons. In this case, I was interested in demonstrating that there are 5 fundamental systems of production. And we built the case around these. We talked about framing and reframing the nature of the transformation as the company changed its approach. We talked about building a new system of production, which was the digital ordering system, how they had to create a new system of record, how they had to develop a system of inquiry with new metrics and new reporting to understand how the digital transformation was going. And then finally, the major finding from this study was that they failed to understand that they had a different system of engagement for each country and often multiple systems of engagement in each country. And they had actually built one system of engagement for the US and then had to scramble to recover. So this was the larger lesson. It fits with a model that we didn't use in this particular case, but this is a model showing how the various pieces fit together. So what you need to do is to start with high quality ingredients. Get the best beef that you can find that's out there, and then take the appropriate cut, that is looking at early stage interventions, and then find a way to garnish it and create a good sauce and finish off with a nice set of desserts. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rick. I'm hungry. Yeah, I'll go catch some beef. No, thank you. Very, very valuable. And for some reason, I don't see Mary. So while we try to recuperate Mary, oh, there she is. There she is. I'm going to turn it to Martin. Martin, what would you add to complete what they already said?
Great lessons. Thanks so much for sharing, Rick and Mary. First of all, I think it's amazing to see over 100 people interested in practice-oriented research and publishing. If we can get all of you to submit one paper to MISQE, It would be awesome. I'll keep it short. I'll just add two aspects here. One from my experience as an SE senior editor for MISQE. In preparation for this call here, I went through all of my SE letters that I wrote and was looking for things that stick out, that I repetitively can recommend to authors submitting to MISQE. And I keep asking them one question, it seems, that is, what is it that practitioners should do differently after reading your paper? And so when to a practice-oriented journal, we hope it's MISQE, focus on the end, on your recommendation, and emphasize the how rather than the what. I see a lot of papers that describe greatly, descriptively, what have they done, but not how it has been done. And that's what most practitioners are actually interested in. It's how do I do this? I have the feeling we're going to talk about recommendations a little later in the panel, so I'm happy to provide more examples there. And then the second aspect is we're talking here about, well, writing a paper, but I think actually practice-oriented research goes beyond just writing one paper. So I would encourage you, go beyond submitting to practice-oriented journals, engage with practitioners. One example, test your ideas with them. At the end of interviews, in workshops, at practitioner events, conferences, in executive education, throw the things that you find at them as hypotheses, hear what they have to say, close that feedback loop. I think we owe it actually to practice, because we only exist, our research only exists because practice is there. I think we owe it to them to close that feedback loop even better. Talk about your findings with them, take in their input, why it works, why it doesn't work for them. It's fun, definitely fulfilling, and it will be super insightful for you.
Thank you, Martin. And I think that's a great segue into sort of the more discussion part, because I think what we want to do now is try to get into the how-to tips, what we learn from doing it, what we learn from judging it, what we learn from helping others try to do it. And before sort of going forward as a structure for the panel, I would say, if you had asked me at a very high level, how do I do a paper for MISQ executive that is really good? I would have said, select a good question, gather first-hand in-depth data, typically in the form of rich cases. Doesn't have to be, but it's definitely the most straightforward way to do it, as Mary and kind of Rick touched upon. And then I wrote 3 editorials. The first 3 editorials I wrote about recommendations, because the way I look at it, your whole paper exists in order to provide recommendations. And I always think of them as being timely, which means novel, which touches on the issue of give me something that I don't know. Actionable, give me something that I can actually do. Don't give me some general high-level platitude about what's good in the world. And then clear, which is about the writing, which is oftentimes also a challenge. You write very differently for a practice audience that you write for an academic audience. So because we don't do this as formal training in our PhD programs, then a panel like this is a great opportunity to ask a bunch of questions. So I'll start. I'll have 3 main questions, but they're mostly designed to get them talking and to get you in the audience thinking about what are your questions. And so put them into the Q&A, look at the ones that are popping up, upvote the ones that you think are capturing what you need. So first of all, good questions. Sounds easy. You know, you wake up one morning, Mary, you just wake up and like, oh, that's a great question I should be researching. Lots of people will be interested in that. How do you find good questions?
Okay, well, I love this. Thank you for pitching this one to me, because this is actually how my entire career has gone. I pick something that makes absolutely no sense to me. And I started back in 1989 with large-scale global outsourcing. and the press was reporting that there was going to be 50% cost savings when a provider came in and took over the IT assets, hired your employees, didn't fire anybody, and it made absolutely no sense to me. So for me, things that are uncharted, ambiguous, complex, something that I don't know the answer to in advance, that's the real joy for me. If I don't know the answer, that other practitioners are struggling, and diving in using that action principles approach, I'm learning along with the practitioners. And that's what I like to do. I like to do things I don't know the answers to.
Does it have to be new technology? Because, when you talk about outsourcing, probably wasn't really any new specific technology, but maybe a new practice?
Right, that's right. So our action principles approach is studying emerging IS practices or emerging technologies. So in my career, I've looked at, as far as the practices side, I've looked at things like prison sourcing, impact sourcing, all different kinds of new emerging practices in that overall broader outsourcing impact. And then really in the last 6 to 7 years, I focused more on emerging technologies like robotic process automation, blockchains, cognitive automation. But to me, and I was inspired by Richard Daft when I was a PhD student, because he said, if you are developing research with such precise hypotheses that you expect to find, what's new? What are you learning that's actually new? And for me personally, I find great joy on the edge of discovery.
Great. Martin, you've done lots of cases, lots of innovative stuff. What's your take on how do you select your good questions?
So one thing is, as a lot of Mary's point there, find stuff that you don't have the answer to, but also talking to practitioners often and regularly. My colleague Bob Wixom from MIT CISR creates boards. She has a data board where practitioners meet regularly and talk about their challenges actually that they have. I love to start studies with interviewing when I have a feeling, well, I don't have a question yet, but I have a topic. I talk to lots of people and ask them what their current biggest challenge is, what keeps them awake at night. Also ask them what they would like to learn. If they had a wish, kind of like, well, I would love to know this, or what they would love to know from other practitioners. That can also be a hint for a good question. Sometimes it's very operational, and then that's probably not a great question to follow, because like, well, I just want to know how much do they spend on X, then that's not a great research question. But very often it is hard challenges that they don't have the answer to, and that can be a good lead.
And Rick, you must have a perspective on this because you ran the SIM Advanced Practice Council, which is just a bunch of CIOs getting together every quarter, right? So what did you learn there about asking good questions?
Yeah, the Advanced Practices Council actually started with getting the members to ask the question. And so I would run a poll once a year, and we would say, what are you interested in? What new technologies, what questions, and those sorts of things. They would vote on those. I'd take the top part of the list and then select academics to come in and talk about those topics. And then we'd work very closely with the academics to make certain that they had a presentation that fitted the way practitioners approach things. And so part of that was we would have to start with a compelling story. Here's a case that really illustrates why you should be interested in this particular technology or methodology. And then we would get them to use a series of smaller cases, vignettes, and then finish up with a framework. This is the garnishing. So all of those little stories would give credibility to what they were proposing. And then you've got to give them something to take away. And this is why I like doing cases. If I just go back why I got started in this, I was given the task of teaching the MBA class at the University of Georgia, and I was using cases. And I thought, I will be a better teacher if I taught one of my own cases. I would know that inside out. I could talk about the personalities and so forth. And also, I was teaching cases from the Northeast or California. Atlanta's a very creative community. So I decided I would mainly write cases about companies in Georgia, and then our students would have some linkages that they might be able to use when they went out and got a job, because most of them go into the Atlanta community. And so that's how I got into this. I wanted to be a better teacher and serve my students better.
That's great. And there's a question actually in the Q&A that I think fits right now, so I'll ask it right now. We all say, you gotta get good questions, things we don't know. But Rudy in the chat in the Q&A said a common problem with practice research is that the results are often responded to as, we already knew that. Like, who decides what is already known? How do you figure, hey, this is a good question because people don't know the answer to, versus I'm gonna spend a year drilling into this, and then people will be like, yeah, well, we knew that. How do you figure, hey, this is a new question?
Well, I think you have to be very opportunistic. So one of the cases I wrote was on NetBank, which was in Atlanta, as you might suspect. It was the first fully internet bank. Nobody knew much about how to run these sort of banks. In fact, the company doubled in size every 6 months for 5 years. It was a wonderful story. And so that was novel. And if you can find a very early first mover, then people are interested to hear about that. But as Mary said, once you're well up in the curve, it's old knowledge, right?
Also, if you are plugged into so I remember when I was starting out, there was a panel like this. I mean, these things recur so often, right? And Samba was on it, Samba Murthy, and he made a point to say, makes me a better academic for academic research to go to practitioner conferences to see what they're talking about, because those may be problems that will come to academia. And I often thought of a practice-oriented research project and a case study, by the way. I totally agree with you, Rick, on if you want to be a great teacher, write your own cases.
Yeah.
But that is a way to learn about a new phenomenon. And then if you have access, which is my next set of topic, and you kind of can be creative and come up with things that are interesting, that is a practitioner piece that it's definitely interesting. So I would say being plugged into a community of practitioners is number one. And I remember, Mary, you telling me that you make it a point to go to practitioner conferences on the practices or technologies you're interested in.
And Gabe, I love that you're talking about this now, because it also addresses, we have some PhD students who have put in the Q&A, how do you convince practitioners to be part of your research? I did this as a PhD student. You go where practitioners are. I had a new assistant professor, and he wasn't connected to practice, and he wanted to study offshore outsourcing. He said, how do we do it? I said, let's go find where the practitioners gather. We went to a sourcing interest group, and he was so excited because he'd sit down and meet people. He goes, the CIO of this Fortune 500 company said he talked to me about his offshoring journey. And then once you start that relationship, then we always say, okay, well, who else is in that person's network, and who else can they connect us to? So I've done this research under Ree Hersheim's he was my dissertation chair and supported me in this effort. So you can do this as a PhD student. You don't have to wait until you have a practitioner network. They value academic insights. They're mostly willing, they're willing to share if you make the effort to meet them where they are. Cold call emails do not work. That is the worst way to try to engage practitioners. You have to go where they are. When we wanted to study robotic process automation, we went to the first international conference of RPA in New York, and I ended up with those first 4 case studies that I had put on earlier. So go where the practitioners are. I'll also point back to our paper that I talked about in JIT. If you look at the footnotes, we've got lots of advice for PhD students that tells you how you can find and engage with practitioners.
So there was a great question, and I had it kind of phrased a little more provocatively, which was, how do you get access if you're not at Harvard? And there you answered it already, right? So I have another kind of Martin, did you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted, because I totally agree. Go where the practitioners are, 100%. So calling or sending emails is definitely works less, but I think it can work if you actually email people who have already talked about something. So you couldn't go to that event, but this person has talked about that. and make it specific to, for example, get the PDFs from that event and talk to them. Well, you've talked at that event about this and this and this, and I would love to talk to you about this and this. So make it very specific to the person, and try to get people who've already shown an interest to communicate to the outer world out there. And if they communicate about it at a conference, the likelihood of them talking to you is much higher.
And I think, the question completed with how to deal with the status difference. And I think this might be a little naive, but there's no status difference in knowledge. The bottom line is, if in that email where you talk about their keynote at minute 22, they talk about this and you agree or disagree, or when you sit down at a table at a conference like Mary said, the key, I think, for busy people is that they're gonna quickly try to assess whether you're gonna waste their time. So you better be ready. And what you want to try to do is offer something that makes them realize, ooh, if I work with this guy, I'm actually going to learn something. It's not going to be a charity event. Oh yeah, okay, I got to do your survey, or I got to sit down an hour for you. It's more like in the back and forth, I'm going to gain something. And I think then quickly the fact that you're a PhD student kind of fades away. And by the way, they probably don't have a PhD, so maybe you have the status advantage. So think of it that way. One other thing I wanted to say real quick on the second question, we always say, gather in-depth data, rich cases. Like the best MISQE submission is one that has one or two cases where you had first-hand knowledge and the story comes alive, right? And everybody's excited because the writing then is also engaging. And we'll get to the writing. There's a question on the writing. But there's 24 hours in a day. The elephant in the room that we're going to talk about at the end is that practice-oriented research is not valued as much as your academic work. And therefore, you want to do it. You have a passion for it, but you also know that there's 24 hours in a day. How can you be efficient? Is there any way you found to be efficient when you're doing this pretty taxing, in-depth type of stuff? And this is like free for all now.
Sure.
Unmute yourself and speak.
Mary, do you want to go first? Otherwise, I'll just throw something out there. I think from a case study, you mentioned a case study, for me is a major investment. Trying to understand a company in depth. And so what I try to gauge is this a success case actually, in the sense of this company is doing something and achieving something that not many others are actually achieving. No company has figured it all out in the questions that we research, but is there one piece of the puzzle where they are a bit ahead? And I only can gauge this from talking to a lot of companies and then finding, wow, they're doing something different and it seems to be working for them. I want to try and find it out. It's not a guarantee for getting a great case, but it helps much more than saying like, oh my gosh, I have a great name, I want to write a case about them. There's lots of boring things about great name companies that are not interesting for a research study. So talk to lots of other companies briefly. So I talk to them 20 minutes, 30 minutes interviews to find out what might be a good case company.
And that's kind of why, again, going back to the action principles approach, is we might do one or two in-depth case studies at the beginning while we're learning, but then you learn to focus and target your questions. And then it's really a much lighter touch. Like, are we seeing this kind of phenomenon in other organizations? And we, do other kinds of maybe just interviews rather than a real in-depth case study. And as far as efficiency of writing, I love to write because I really don't know what I think until I write it down. So the process of writing for me helps me formalize my thinking. And I like to begin with the practitioner pieces first, because the theoretical thinking is much more difficult, and it requires more time and investment in writing an academic paper than it is in writing like a Sloan Management Review paper, a Harvard Business Review paper, an MIS Quarterly Executive one. To me, they're not an either or, but I would say do the practice first, because it has to be timely, as you said, Gabe, right? You don't want, we don't really want to see case studies in MIS Quarterly Executive from 6 years ago, right? So get your practitioner writing done first, and then do your deep theoretical thinking and papers later.
Yeah, that was sort of my approach. I was lucky in a way that I ended up in my first job at a school that valued good teaching and valued the ability to speak to practice. In fact, tenure packets would go out to academics and, in my case, the CIOs, to practitioner in your field, which was scary and exciting at the same time. And my advisors, Blake Ives, he used to say, you got to do one project and get multiple outputs. That's the only way you're going to survive. So I kind of got on this thing about getting a teaching case, a practitioner piece, and a full academic kind of project, all wrapped up as three pieces of the same thing. It doesn't always work. It depends on the question, depends on luck, access, lots of different things. But get a teaching case early that makes you a better teacher, and you could probably send it to AIS or other case series where you're doing a benefit for other people as well. Then abstract basically your teaching note. Here's my light. The teaching note of your teaching case as you're thinking about what you're seeing. It can evolve into a practice piece, and then of course in time you hopefully have some deeper theoretical thing coming out of there, multiple projects again. We don't have a huge amount of time, but we're already taking questions. And so the next one is my big thing, as you know, this idea of recommendations. And this dovetails with the question that got a bunch of upvotes here that says, you mentioned the writing style is different for practitioner and academic audiences. Can you explain the key differences and any great examples? So I'm going to tee it off, but then I'm going to ask you guys to sort of comment on this because it's very important. What is the key ingredient in terms of writing? And if you have great papers that inspired you or that you wrote that you think people should look at, just toss them out as you speak. Here's what I would say. Everything that you do when you write a practitioner piece is really about, so what am I going to do with that? And one of the challenges I think we have at MISQ Executive or any practitioner journal is that busy executives don't have a lot of time to read, and our papers tend to be long. So you're starting to see a lot of the HBR and the more, I don't want to say magazine style, but the high readership pieces, journals shrinking. And you get to a point where I start to feel uncomfortable because you're like in 2 pages, you're telling somebody how to solve the biggest problem in their career. It seems a little difficult to do and maybe nonsensical. But the point is, number one, you have to deliver value. And to me, is recommendations. Again, timely, actionable, and clear. That's the way to look at it. So not a lot. Sometimes we get 12 recommendations in an MSQE. Not going to work. I think the sweet spot for me is 4 to 6. It's not a recipe, but that's the way I look at it. As you said, Mary, eliminate the things we already know, right? Yes, of course. Championship from the top is critical. Right? Otherwise, the project's not going to fly. But how does that change when you're doing blockchain? Does it? It doesn't? Okay. So maybe you can touch upon the basics and then drill into the ones that are really specific to this practice or technology. Circle back to your case or your data or whatever primary evidence you're bringing to build your credibility is not there just to do that, but it's also there to trickle into your recommendation and make them come alive, right? So there's a lot of things you can do, and I don't want to keep talking about it, but I think that's the key, these recommendations. So maybe even broader to all 3 of you, and I'd like to hear from all 3 of you on this one. What do you think is the key difference for somebody who's been trained as an academic, who's successful academic at publishing for the academia? What is the key transition they have to make in terms of writing? And if you have great examples, throw them out for people to read. Rick, you want to go first maybe? You have been quiet for a while.
Yeah, I actually don't think there's any difference in writing. I'm always striving to engage with the audience. And so even when I'm writing for an academic article, I'm trying to write in a very straightforward and direct fashion. I'm not trying to confuse people. Though I do get criticized at times for I'm too tutorially oriented, which could be a compliment. I'm trying to tell people, I'm trying to explain some situation, and I don't see that there's a great difference, except in an academic paper, you've got to follow the sentence with half a dozen citations, which become footnotes elsewhere. But I just think it's good, clear writing. I think what's important for practitioners is understand they're probably going to skim your article.
Yes.
And not read it carefully. So you need good, clear headings. You need bullets that they can quickly look at things. You need diagrams that capture the paper. And as I said before, if I can get the diagram right, the paper writes itself. And then I think you need a catchy ending that leaves them thinking about the situation more deeply than the case.
The diagram point is interesting because it suggests to me that if you can diagram it, it means you really understand what you're trying to say. Then the writing is sort of easy. One thing I would say, though, I would caution people, MISQ Executive has a very unique, peculiar positioning. Also relative to, the Harvard Business Review and the Sloan Management. It is by academic writers, but practice oriented, which means that it needs to be interesting and readable to executives. And I always say current and future, which means hopefully people that are currently practicing will read, but they don't have a lot of time. But a huge audience that you have when you write for MISQE, and you have to keep in mind, is your executive MBA students, your master students, is your future leaders. And they will write it because it'll be assigned to them and be discussed in class. So you don't want to fall into this magazine style, also because it's going to be reviewed by rigorous academic SEs and reviewers. But one thing that you can easily see as a different style of writing, I'll just talk about the mechanics so that Mary and Martin can talk about the more difficult things. But mechanically, it's very easy to see the difference. We don't have a theory section. We don't have a front-loaded methodology section. We do have methods. If you look at the papers, typically the standard structure is that you do talk about your methodology in the appendix. And the audience there is your reviewers and SEs who want to be sure that you're not just opinionating because you woke up one day and started. And we do get a lot of papers like this, unfortunately, that we send back either as reject without prejudice or as editorial revision to say, what is this really based on? It's not clear yet, right? So the methodology is important, but it's not front-loaded. Theory is, the famous Lewin quote, right? There's nothing as practical as good theory. Yes, that's true, but cannot be in your face. And so it has to kind of inform your thinking maybe, but we don't have a theory section. We don't have a literature review section. So mechanically, all you have to do is look at the papers and you'll see there are different sections. Now, in terms of more the writing, the engaging, the style, what can you say to that, Martin and Mary, to help people get the style of an MISQE or practitioner paper?
It might just fall back to what Rick said, good writing practice, but still I do actually, when I read papers that are written for practitioners versus ones that are not, I do see differences still. And it might just be that you say, well, but then it's not good writing. One difference that I do see is that papers for practitioners need to be written in a more top-down style versus a bottom-up style. So you cannot say argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, argument 4, and hence you see there's no other thing than to see that this is now the conclusion. You got to say, this is my point, and here are the reasons why this point actually makes sense. You're kind of turning it around because they are skimming this. You're actually giving them a paragraph where they decide, do I want to read this on further or not? And so turn your way of argumentation down to start with, this is actually the point, and now I'm going to go into detail. Short sentences. I know this is just good writing style, but man, cut your sentences, people, I should say, cut your sentences by half and then make them shorter.
Yes. The only other thing I'll add, and I completely agree with all the comments that you made, we want to keep we got to assume that the cognitive burden on the reader has to be very low, and that they are going to decide whether to read your paper just by looking at the title, the abstract, tables, pictures, and your subheadings, and maybe your bolded recommendations. I also advise people, read your paper out loud. Before you submit it, read it out loud. That will tell you immediately whether it's engaging, whether your sentences are so long. If you have to take a breath while you're still on a sentence, right, Martin, it's too long. And I think just having the discipline, I always read my papers out loud before I submit them to anybody. And the other thing is to hire professional writers. A lot of our deans now do that. I never submit a paper to you, Gabe, until I've had it professionally edited, right? If you start seeing sloppy grammar, none of us can edit our own work. Then you start to think the research is sloppy. So appreciating the fact that your senior editors, your reviewers, and ultimately your end readers, you've got to make this a joyful experience for them. And there's a lot you can do up front to make sure you have the best paper before you submit it. Don't have the attitude, well, I'm just going to do the submission to get the revision. That's the worst. That we don't want to see that, right? We want to see things that are polished and professional, and know that, then we have more confidence in the research approach and the recommendations that you're making.
I mean, get the easy stuff right. That's the message, right? It's hard to be creative, timely, to say something, that informs people whose daily work is about that thing. Those are the hard things. I mean, don't send me spelling, something that is not readable, something that doesn't look like you put in your best effort. That's the easy stuff. Get the easy stuff right, and the rest hopefully will fall into place. I'll say one more thing about style. I've always thought, so if you care about practice-oriented research, I think you want to do, as we said at the beginning, I think Mary or somebody else said at the beginning, you want to teach executives. That is the easiest way to engage without even leaving your university, right? Sign up for the Executive MBA program and try to teach the course there. And I think of writing for MISQE as the way you would teach a really nice, really engaging exec ed program, right? You're not going to come in with a bunch of theory. You're going to try to be provocative to get the people to think, but you got to bring your evidence. You can't just be opinionating and they trust you because you have a PhD after your name. I'm going to try to take one more. Here's a provocative one. So how do you differentiate what we do from consulting? Anybody thought of that? And is it any different when you write for practitioner audiences?
Well, we're not trying to sell the next consulting assignment. So that's important. I think we have a much larger landscape that we work with than consultants. I mean, we've educated many of the people that are consultants, and they are schooled in a particular methodology that they can scale across their company with some quality. We are free to think far more broadly. We're exposed to far more theories. We have a much better view of how the world works. And you can bring that into a case study that a consultant might never have come across. So our education is better, and that's our advantage.
Having been a consultant in my previous life, this is very different. As a consultant, I try to solve a specific problem for a company that is paying me to solve that specific problem. As a researcher, this might sound arrogant, but I'm not interested in solving that specific company's problem. I'm looking for basically classes of problems and try to understand, well,
It's
what
not
is
arrogant, Martin. It's your
that is the problem.
It's a great definition of the
I do hope that many of those companies then take the MISQ e-paper and say, oh my gosh, this is going to help me there. But yeah, it's a
maybe then you get some consulting gigs on the side, but that's another story. But I think you articulated it really well, I think, right? And if you mix the two between Rick and Martin, what they're saying is, one, we have the long view. We're not solving this problem as it is the first time that this technology comes to bear. Technology recurs, right? So this technology may be a latest incarnation of a problem I've seen 20 years ago. And so that long view is helpful. And classes of problem, not specific solutions. That is the other big difference between what we do.
Well, I'll just chime in here too and say that I see consulting as an intervention, right? You're trying to intervene in an organization, and the action principles approach that we're talking about, we call them kind of pre-interventions. So I do consulting work, but I don't go in and tell a company this is what you should do. What I do is these are companies that we study. These are unique practices or the robust practices. I give a lot of agencies to senior executives. That's why they've been hired. All I do is share what I've learned, and it's up to them to look at these principles to say, yes, that applies to my context. No, that wouldn't work here. I give lots and lots of agency and respect to practitioners. And so I do consulting, but it's not with, you should do this. It's consider what these other people did. These are the outcomes they had. Does this apply to you? And it's more like an engaged co-creation and a conversation than a solid prescription of you should do this.
I saw an interview with March once where he was talking exactly about this. Why would you call in an academic? And what you're saying, I think, Mary, is I'm not coming in to solve your problem. I'm coming in to give you all the knowledge that I have about this class of problems to help you think through your solution, because you know more about what's going to work in your company than me. I can just help you think through what's going to work. Is that a fair way to rephrase it?
Absolutely. That's beautiful. You help them with a framing, and and that's their job to decide.
Right. And truth be told, they're probably better than you anyway, because they live and breathe that company every day. So they're going to have a better solution once they're helped. You can't go in and that would be arrogant, right? I'm going to show up and solve your problem. I'm going to take one more because I love the pushback. All right, folks, you make it sound so easy to reach out to practitioners. How easy really is it? I have an answer if you're stumped, but I'd like
I think we did answer that. Didn't we talk? We talked a lot about that, going to where the practitioners are. Martin talked about how to follow up if they've already spoken. So Gabe,
the question is, how really easy is it? How really easy is it?
It is how easy as you try, right? I mean, so is it as easy
exactly,
as...
The answer is that it's not easy.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it is easy. You just have to be willing to go to bat a couple times. You're going to get no's. People are busy, but it's not personal.
Yeah.
So I do think it's easy as long as you're persistent. You have confidence that what you want to do is worthwhile. You'll find the right people. I always say, that 6 degrees of separation on the planet. If you don't know somebody in your social network can help. I've also advised, students from different countries. Well, it may be hard for you to find practitioners here, but go back to your home countries. Boy, that really helps your advisors too. Creates more global research. I do think it's easy. I have not find this to be hard at all.
What I meant, Mary, easy is the wrong word, but you better do your work, particularly early on. I mean, for you, it's now natural. You got your networks and stuff. But the question was, if you're a PhD student with this status difference and blah, 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 I would say it's not easy for that. Let's not trivialize it in the sense that, but easy or hard is not even the frame. The right framing is, does it take work? Yes. You got to want to do it. And if you don't love it, just don't do it. But if you love it, be persistent, be prepared. You gotta one chance to come across as somebody who knows what they're doing. They're not gonna waste somebody else's time. They're not looking for charity. I've been thinking about this problem. I know you've been talking at these conferences about this problem. Here's the way I look at it. Can I have half an hour of your time? That goes over much better than, I'm doing my dissertation, would you give me a hand? Cold email.
A page to say, and this is what my dissertation is all about. Don't you find it interesting? Yeah.
And this is half my paper. Can you read it and let me know if you're interested? Right? All that stuff never gonna work. Anyway, as always, when the panel is ran by an Italian, we go long.
But we started on time.
Yeah, because Brooke started. We started 10 minutes late. Well, first of all, let me thank you three, obviously, for all the work you do at MISQE, first and foremost. As I always say, it's for a great cause. If we lose our connection to practice, I'm not sure why we're doing what we do. So thank you. Thank you for the support from AIS for putting these things together. Thank you to Brooke for helping us through getting this done. And of course, thank you to the over 100 people who came and who asked all these questions. We didn't get to all the questions. I know that there are breakout tables where the conversation can continue. So the program will stay open. You can move to tables and keep talking about this. And we may try to join some tables real quick. But other than that, I think it'll be recorded. So if you couldn't make the live session, at least you can get some insight later. So thanks everybody.
Thank you, Gabe.
And
Thanks, Gabe.